This is the history of the Vikings, not as raiders, not as traders, not as legends carved into stone, but as the last men who chose where the world would slow. In the deep winter of a forgotten year, 47 Viking warriors climbed a mountain pass that did not appear on any map. Snow fell heavy and without sound, erasing their tracks as if the land itself wished to hide what was about to happen. Pine forests stood frozen on either side, their branches bowed like witnesses who dared not look away. These Vikings were not kings, they were not conquerors, they were survivors. Behind them lay burned longhouses, broken shrines, and the bodies of kin left unburied in the snow. An enemy had come, an enemy unlike any the North had faced before. Not rival clans, not southern armies, but a force that moved with unnatural order, unnatural weapons, and a hunger that did not speak in human language. The Vikings did not yet call them Martians. They called them Sky Iron Ones, red spirits, those who fell from fire, and they were coming again. The 47 reached the crest of the pass before dawn. Their armor was mismatched, mail taken from fathers, helmets cracked in earlier wars, shields repaired so many times the wood beneath barely remembered its first shape. But their weapons were true, axes sharpened by hand, spears balanced by feel, not measurement, swords carried by men who had already decided how they would die. The pass was narrow, too narrow for numbers. Stone walls rose sharply on both sides, forcing the road into a funnel of ice and shadow. Beneath the snow lay frozen meltwater, slick and treacherous. Horses would struggle here, heavy steps would slide, momentum would die. An old Viking named Hoy, white-bearded, scarred, and still standing when younger men had already fallen, pressed his spear into the frozen ground and looked down the road. "This is where they slow," Hoy said. No one asked how many were coming. They knew. The Vikings worked quickly and in silence, the way men do when they understand time is no longer theirs. Stones were dragged into bends in the road. Snow was scraped thin to expose ice. Archers marked distances by memory and instinct. Shieldmen tested where to brace, where the earth would hold, and where it would betray anyone foolish enough to rush. When dawn came, it brought light but no warmth. By mid-morning, the sound reached them, not horns, not voices. A deep, rhythmic pulse, mechanical, relentless, echoing up from the valley. The sound of something that did not fear mountains, did not fear winter, and did not fear men. The Martians were advancing. The Vikings did not shout, they did not answer. The first scouts appeared, figures encased in strange armor, moving with precision that felt wrong to human eyes. They saw the Vikings standing across the pass and paused. 47 men. No fort, no walls, no retreat. The scouts withdrew. Soon the full force gathered below the pass, hundreds, then thousands. Shapes that reflected light differently. Weapons that hummed instead of rang. Commanders that did not ride horses but machines that pressed into the snow without slipping. They believed the road would open. The first volley came from weapons the Vikings did not fully understand, projectiles that cut the air with a sound like tearing cloth. Shields rose, wood shattered, iron rang. One Viking fell, then another. Blood steamed in the cold. The line held. Again the Martians fired. Again the Vikings endured. This was the first mistake the invaders made. They had conquered through certainty, through speed, through fear, but they had never faced men who had already accepted death and chosen the ground where it would be paid for. When the Martians advanced into the pass, their machines lost space. Their formations compressed. Ice stole their footing. Fallen units blocked those behind them. And that was when the Viking axes rose, The fighting became close, brutal, personal. Steel against alloy, breath against breath. The Vikings did not chase. They did not break formation. They fought the way their ancestors had taught them, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, making every step forward cost more than the last. Hour by hour, the pass filled with wreckage. As the light began to fade, a thought spread among the invaders, a thought no weapon could silence. This place was chosen. The Vikings stood as the sun sank low, fewer now, bleeding, exhausted, but still standing. They did not know this was only the beginning. They did not yet know that this war would stretch beyond mountains, beyond seas, beyond earth itself. But here, in this frozen pass, the Vikings proved something that would echo across worlds. Even enemies from the sky can be made to slow, and when they slow, they can be wounded. When the sky bled and the Vikings learned the enemy's name, let me continue the telling, because what followed in that mountain pass is where the story stopped belonging only to men and began to belong to memory itself. By nightfall, the snow no longer reflected moonlight. It drank it. Blood, oil, shattered metal, and crushed ice had turned the road into something darker than earth. Of the 47 Vikings who had stood at dawn, only 33 still breathed. Some leaned on shields to remain upright. Others knelt, working broken fingers back into place around spear shafts slick with gore. They did not cheer. Vikings do not cheer when the dead are not yet counted. Below them, the Martians withdrew for the first time, not in panic, not in disorder, but with hesitation, and for beings like them, hesitation was already defeat. Their machines backed down the slope, dragging damaged units behind them. Lights dimmed. The humming weapons fell silent. Only the wind returned, moving through the pass as if afraid to linger. Hoy walked the line. He spoke names. He touched shoulders. He closed the eyes of the dead where they lay, marking each fallen Viking with a line of blood across the brow so the gods would know them. Only then did he look down the road again. What we fought today, he said, was not an army. The younger Vikings listened. They had seen strange wars before, foreign weapons, southern tricks, but nothing like this. These are not men, Hoy continued. They do not fear death, they fear cost. That night the Martians did something new. They watched. Lights appeared on the valley floor, steady and unblinking, hovering above the ground like captive stars. The Vikings could feel eyes on them, measuring, calculating, remembering. The invaders were learning. So did the Vikings. They learned that Martian weapons lost accuracy in cold, that their machines struggled on ice, that when forced into narrow ground, their coordination fractured. Most importantly, they learned this: the Martians did not understand refusal. They expected retreat, collapse, submission. They did not understand men who chose to stand simply because standing denied the enemy certainty. Before dawn, the second assault began, not with noise, with silence. The Martians advanced slowly this time, spreading devices across the snow, small, crawling things that cut into the ice and released heat. Steam rose. The ground softened, then refroze unevenly. They were changing the battlefield. Hoy saw it immediately. They are trying to take the mountain away from us, he said. So the Vikings moved first. This was the moment later skalds would argue over, the moment when men armed with axes charged beings born under another sky. The Vikings did not run screaming. They advanced as a wall, shields overlapping, feet placed with care, forcing the Martians to fight on ground still hostile to them. When the clash came, it was worse than before. Martian weapons burned instead of cut. Shields smoked. Male glowed red where it held just long enough. 2 Vikings died screaming as heat found gaps no blade ever could. But for every Viking that fell, a Martian unit shattered under steel meant to break bone, not logic. Axes bit into joints. Spears punched through lenses and seams. A Viking named Eirik leapt onto one of the hovering machines, drove his sword into its core, and vanished in a flash that left nothing but scorched snow and a helmet rolling downhill. The pass screamed. By midday, the Martians changed tactics again. They spoke, not with mouths but with sound forced directly into the skull, cold, precise, merciless. This resistance is inefficient. This resistance will end. Submit and be preserved. The Vikings answered the only way they knew. They sang, not loudly, not beautifully. They sang names, fathers, brothers, sons, long-dead kings, forgotten warriors. They sang of ice and sea, of dying with a weapon in hand, of gods who respected courage more than survival. The sound carried strangely in the pass, breaking the Martian signal, disrupting their coordination in ways they could not immediately explain. By evening, the Martians pulled back again, this time farther. That night, the Vikings finally named their enemy aloud. "They are not spirits," Hoy said. "They bleed, they break. They retreat," he spat into the snow. "They are just far from home." The surviving Vikings understood then that this was not a battle meant to be won in a day. This was a holding, a delaying, a teaching of lessons. And somewhere above the clouds, beyond sight, beyond belief, other Martians were listening, learning that the people of this cold world would not kneel easily. The war had moved beyond the mountain, and the Vikings had become its first teachers. The third day began without sunrise. Clouds sealed the sky in a lid of iron gray, and snow fell sideways, driven by a wind that howled through the pass like something alive and angry. The Vikings woke stiff, wounded, and fewer still. Of the 47 who had climbed the mountain, only 29 could stand without help. 6 more lived but could not fight. They were laid against the rock wall, wrapped in cloaks, axes placed in their hands so they would not wake ashamed. Hoy did not sleep. He stood at the narrowest point of the pass and watched the valley below, because he understood something the others were only beginning to feel. The Martians would not stop. They had withdrawn twice, yes, but not in defeat. They were adapting, measuring loss, recalculating value. For them, this was not war in the human sense. It was an equation, and equations, once written, demand solutions. Before dawn, the solution arrived. The ground began to hum, not loudly, not violently. A low vibration that traveled through stone and bone alike. Snow slid from ledges. Loose rocks trembled. The Vikings felt it in their teeth, in old injuries, in the scars that had never fully healed. "They are digging," one of the younger men said. Hoy nodded. The Martians did not need the road anymore. They were cutting through the mountain. That realization changed everything. Hoy gathered the remaining fighters close, his voice steady, unhurried, the way a man speaks when fear has already been weighed and found unimportant. "We cannot hold stone against fire," he said, "and we cannot wait for the mountain to be taken from us." A pause. "So we take something from them." The plan was simple, brutal, Viking. They would leave the pass, not retreat, advance. When the Martians expected defense, the Vikings would descend into the valley, into the machines, into the heart of the thing that believed it could reduce men to numbers. The wounded protested. The younger men hesitated. Hoy cut them off. "We were never meant to live through this," he said, "but we can decide what survives." Before the Martians emerged from the rock, the Vikings moved. They descended the frozen road in silence, using the same ice that had betrayed their enemies to mask their approach. Smoke from damaged Martian units hung low in the valley, thick and metallic. Lights pulsed irregularly. Machines stood half buried, half awake, repairing themselves with movements too smooth, too deliberate to be alive. The first Viking axe fell without a sound. Then another. The valley erupted. Alarms shrieked sharp alien tones that cut through the wind. Weapons flared to life. Heat scorched snow into steam. But now the fighting was scattered, close, confused, exactly where the Vikings thrived. They smashed power cores. They dragged Martian units down and buried them under their own weight. Spears jammed into joints. Swords hammered again and again at the same weak points learned through blood. A Viking named Rolf died laughing as he detonated a captured device, taking himself and 3 machines with him in a pillar of white fire. Another, seen, fought with a broken arm, shield strapped to her body, stabbing until the ground beneath her collapsed into burning ruin. Hoy reached the largest structure at the center of the valley, a towering construct pulsing with light, cables sunk deep into the earth like roots. He understood without being told. This was how they spoke to the sky. Hoy climbed. Weapons burned him. The heat took his beard, his skin, his breath. He kept climbing. When he reached the core, he did not hesitate. He drove his axe into it once, twice, until the light fractured and the humming scream cut off mid-note. The valley went silent, not peaceful, empty. The surviving Vikings gathered as the structures failed, collapsing inward, folding like dying beasts. Above them, something vast shifted behind the clouds. A presence, watching, remembering. They had done more than kill. They had been noticed. That night, as the wounded died and the living tended them, the sky burned red for a long moment, as if a distant world had turned its face away in anger. The Vikings did not know what Mars was. They did not know how far the war would reach. But they knew this. They had forced the enemy to look back. And no empire on Earth or beyond it ever forgives that. The saga did not end in the valley. It had only learned how to leave the ground. The sky did not return to normal after the valley burned. For 3 nights, the stars shifted in ways no sailor recognized. Constellations slid, bent, rearranged themselves like pieces on a board being reset by an unseen hand. The aurora came early and wrong, red instead of green, stretched thin like wounded banners across the cold heavens. The Vikings watched in silence. They were 21 now, 21 out of 47. Those who still lived carried wounds that would never heal cleanly. Burns that smelled faintly of iron even after snow and water. Scars that ached when the sky hummed. But they also carried something new, knowledge paid for in blood. The Martians did not come again that winter. That, more than anything, frightened Hoy. Because enemies who leave without finishing a war are not retreating. They are preparing. The Vikings burned their dead in the old way, building pyres from broken Martian wreckage and mountain pine. Steel from another world melted and ran like silver tears into the snow. Names were spoken, deeds remembered. Ash scattered where the wind could carry it north toward home. When it was done, Hoy gathered the survivors. "We cannot stay," he said, "and we cannot pretend this was the end." No one argued. They descended from the mountain and spread out, not as warriors seeking glory, but as messengers carrying a warning too heavy for one voice. Some went east toward forests and rivers. Others went south to coasts and trading towns. A few went west where the sea waited, restless and familiar. Wherever they went, the story followed. Not all believed it. Some laughed at tales of iron men from the sky, of weapons that burned without flame, of enemies who spoke inside the skull. But others listened, especially those who had seen strange lights over fields, or found animals dead without wound or mark, or heard the sky hum on clear nights. The Vikings spoke as history tellers now, not warriors boasting of battle. They spoke of terrain, of narrow places, of refusing momentum, of making victory too expensive to be worth claiming. Years passed, kings rose and fell, wars came and went. The world tried very hard to forget, but the sky did not. The Martians returned, not in force, not in fire, but in whispers and probes and silent machines that watched from high places. They learned humanity the way hunters learn prey. They avoided the mountains, avoided the cold, avoided places where people still sang of old gods and stood too close together. And the Vikings watched back, not as an empire, not as a nation, as a memory that refused to die. Hoy lived long enough to see gray in the beards of boys who had once followed him, long enough to hear rumors of similar battles in other lands, small groups standing in narrow places against things that should have crushed them. Forest ambushes, frozen rivers, cities that did not fall as easily as expected. Before he died, Hoy spoke once more. "They will come again," he said, "not as soldiers, as rulers." "And when they do?" a young warrior asked. Hoy smiled, thin and tired. "Then tell the story again," he said, "because they still do not understand us." He died with the sky quiet above him, but far beyond the clouds, far beyond earth, something recorded his name, not as an enemy, as a variable. The saga of the Vikings did not end with longships or swords. It did not end with kings or graves. It became something older and stranger, a warning written not in books but in behavior, a truth embedded in human resistance itself, that when the world is narrowed, when the ground is chosen, when men decide that survival is optional but meaning is not, even those who come from the stars can be made to bleed. Years after the mountain pass and the burning valley, the Martians returned, not with armies marching openly, not with fire falling from the sky, but with patience. They stopped trying to break humanity the way stone breaks under a hammer. Instead, they studied how stone bends under pressure without cracking. The Vikings noticed first. They were older now. Some had settled into lives that looked ordinary from a distance, farmers, traders, guards, storytellers. But none of them ever truly left the war. They felt it in the way birds scattered without cause, in the way iron tools rang differently at dawn, in the way dreams repeated the same red sky over and over. The Martians began to influence rather than invade. Harvests failed in patterns too precise to be natural. Conflicts ignited between neighboring clans with timing too convenient to be coincidence. Weapons broke at the worst possible moments. Leaders who preached unity fell ill. Others rose preaching obedience, order, safety at any cost. The sky stayed quiet. That was the warning. Hoy's words were remembered then, passed from mouth to mouth like contraband truth. Enemies who do not finish wars are planning to rule. The Vikings gathered again, not in one place but many. Small circles, quiet meetings. Old warriors teaching young ones not just how to fight but how to think, how to choose ground, how to recognize manipulation disguised as peace. They taught this above all else. Never let the enemy decide the terms. The Martians introduced tools, gifts, really. Devices that improved yields, metals that never dulled, knowledge that shortened labor and lengthened life. Many accepted them, some worshipped them. A few began to speak the Martian logic aloud, claiming resistance was inefficient, outdated, unnecessary. Those people did not last long among the Vikings, not because they were killed, because they were ignored. Isolation, the Vikings knew, was a weapon as sharp as any axe. The Martians learned another lesson then, one they recorded carefully. Human resistance does not always announce itself. It hides in culture, in stubborn habits, in stories told too often and believed too deeply to uproot. Every time the Martians attempted centralized control, it failed in the north. Orders slowed. Systems broke down in forests and mountains. Units disappeared. Devices vanished. Information returned incomplete, distorted, or useless. Always in places where people still told the old stories, still sang the old songs, still remembered that 47 Vikings once chose a narrow place and said no. The Martians escalated, not with fire, with erasure. Records vanished, evidence dissolved, memories were challenged, rewritten, softened. The story of the mountain pass became legend, then exaggeration, then myth, then folklore. Scholars argued, officials reassured. The world moved on, but the Vikings did not rely on books. They relied on repetition. Grandfathers told it to grandchildren not as fantasy but as instruction, not as pride but as warning. Names were preserved, places remembered without being marked. The truth survived not in detail but in shape. When the Martians finally understood this, it was too late. They could suppress technology. They could distort history. They could guide empires. But they could not erase a species that had learned how to fight without permission. And somewhere beyond the sky, the Martians adjusted their projections. Humanity would not be ruled quickly. It would not be ruled cleanly. And if it was ever to be ruled at all, it would have to be broken in ways that did not create heroes. That realization frightened them more than any Viking axe ever had, because heroes die, but habits endure. There comes a moment in every long war when the fighting stops being about territory or power or survival. It becomes about time. The Martians reached that moment slowly, reluctantly, the way all superior forces do when faced with an enemy that refuses to collapse on schedule. Their models grew dense with exceptions. Their projections lengthened. Victory did not disappear, but it drifted farther away, receding into generations yet unborn. The Vikings understood this instinctively. They had always understood time. They came from a people who knew winters longer than kings' reigns, who trusted stone and wood more than promises, who measured success not by expansion, but by whether something precious endured. So they stopped fighting the Martians directly. Instead, they made themselves impossible to finish. The last of the original 47 died within a decade of the mountain pass, some from wounds that never healed properly, some from sickness, some quietly in their sleep, hands scarred and empty. When the last of them was burned and the ashes scattered, the Martians recorded it as a success. The resistance leaders were gone. What they did not understand was that the Vikings had never intended to remain leaders. They had intended to become a pattern. Across the north, behaviors spread without banners or commands. Communities refused centralization. Roads curved instead of running straight. Settlements favored difficult ground, hills, forests, coasts battered by storms. Leadership rotated. Knowledge fragmented and was shared orally, redundantly, messily. To the Martians, it looked inefficient. To the Vikings, it looked familiar. Whenever Martian influence increased, something small but persistent went wrong. A relay failed. A supply chain slowed. A local authority vanished into obscurity. Devices stopped functioning correctly in extreme cold or damp or magnetic stone. Always just enough failure to prevent dominance, never enough to justify annihilation. The Martians began to understand something new. They were not fighting warriors anymore. They were fighting inheritance. In one recorded exchange, intercepted centuries later, an intelligence construct asked a question its creators had not anticipated. How do you defeat an enemy that does not need to win? The answer never came, because by then the Vikings were no longer a people you could point to. They were sailors who distrusted clear skies, farmers who refused straight lines, parents who taught children stories that did not explain themselves fully, communities that instinctively chose narrow ground when pressure came. They were everywhere the Martians tried to be absolute, and nowhere the Martians could strike cleanly. The invaders attempted one final strategy. They stopped interfering. They withdrew influence, reduced presence, let humanity advance on its own. The models predicted that without pressure, the old habits would decay. Centralization would occur naturally. Order would rise, control would follow. For a time it seemed to work. Empires formed, cities grew, skies filled with human machines. The Martians waited. Then quietly the stories returned, not of Martians, not of stars, but of Vikings, of 47 who chose a pass, of ground that mattered, of refusing momentum, of selling resistance dearly. The Martians observed something they could no longer deny. Humanity's greatest weapon was not technology. It was memory shaped into instinct. And the Vikings had taught them how to use it. Long after the Martians retreated beyond observation range, long after their probes went dark, the pattern remained. When humanity faced threats, whether from beyond the sky or from within itself, it returned unconsciously to narrow places and stubborn refusals. Stand together, deny certainty, make domination expensive. The Vikings never ruled the world. They did something far more dangerous. They taught it how to say no, even to the stars. Every long war ends the same way for those who cannot win it, not with surrender, with erasure. The Martians reached that conclusion after centuries of observation. They had failed to dominate humanity through force, failed to guide it through influence, failed to dissolve it through time. The Viking pattern, the refusal, the narrow ground, the instinct to resist without central command, persisted like a flaw that could not be corrected. So the Martians chose a final solution. They would remove the story itself. Not the people, not the world, the memory. It began subtly. Signals embedded in human technology caused archives to degrade. Digital records glitched. Ancient manuscripts decayed faster than chemistry allowed. Oral traditions lost key details, softened at the edges, reframed as metaphor instead of instruction. The Martians did not erase everything. They erased meaning. The mountain pass became a legend with no location. Hoy became a name without context. The 47 became a number people repeated without knowing why. And for a while it worked. Humanity advanced, faster, louder, more confident. Cities grew tall and brittle. Systems centralized again. Efficiency replaced redundancy. Straight lines returned. The world smoothed itself for speed. From orbit the Martians saw what they wanted to see. The pattern was breaking. Then came the narrowing. It was not an invasion. It was not an attack. It was pressure. Resources thinned. Climate shifted. Networks strained. Conflicts overlapped and compounded. Humanity found itself forced, again and again, into difficult choices, tight spaces, moments where momentum no longer worked. And without being told, without remembering why, people began to do something strange. They clustered, they decentralized, they mistrusted certainty. Small groups held mountain passes, not literal ones, but economic, digital, cultural. Systems fractured intentionally. Redundancy returned. Stories resurfaced, incomplete but persistent, told differently in different places but shaped the same way. Stand together, deny certainty, make control expensive. The Martians watched in disbelief. They had erased the story, but the story had already rewritten itself into behavior. One Martian construct, older than the others, finally articulated the truth. The narrative is not stored in memory. It is stored in response. The Vikings had never meant their saga to survive as text. They had meant it to survive as instinct. When the Martians attempted one last intervention, targeted, precise, surgical, they found no center to strike. No capital, no leader, no doctrine, only countless small refusals, each insignificant alone, devastating together. The Martians withdrew then, not in defeat, in recognition. They marked Earth as a world that could not be ruled without becoming something they were not willing to be. A war that could not be finished without learning how to lose. And so they left humanity with its stories half remembered, half forgotten, fully alive. Somewhere, even now, a child hears a tale about Vikings who stood in a narrow place and says nothing, but remembers the shape of it. That is enough. Because stories do not need to be believed to work. They only need to be repeated. Every saga, if it is honest, ends the same way. Not with victory, not with peace, but with continuation. The Martians never returned in force. Not because they were defeated and not because they forgave. They left because they understood something at last, something the Vikings had always known and never bothered to explain. Some wars cannot be ended. They can only be made unprofitable. From the cold mountain pass where 47 Vikings chose their ground, to the centuries of quiet resistance that followed, the conflict never truly stopped. It simply dissolved into the way humanity reacted to pressure, into habits so old they felt natural, into refusals that did not announce themselves as rebellion. No one built monuments to Hoy. No empire claimed the victory. No chronicle recorded the war as it happened, and that was the final irony. The Martians searched for closure. They searched for treaties, conclusions, endpoints they could catalog and move past. They never found them. Earth offered none. Humanity offered none. Instead, the lesson endured without permission. When certainty arrived, people questioned it. When systems grew perfect, people distrusted them. When power demanded smoothness, people chose friction. The Vikings had not taught humanity how to fight Martians. They had taught it how to fight inevitability. Long after Mars itself cooled, long after the red world became nothing more than a distant symbol in human stories, the pattern still surfaced. Against tyrants, against collapsing systems, against forces that claimed resistance was pointless. Somewhere, always, someone chose the narrow place. And stood. That is why the Martians never came back, not because Earth was strong, but because it was stubborn in ways that could not be removed. This is how the Vikings won a war no one remembers fighting. This is how humanity learned to endure without asking permission. And this is why the story never truly ends. Because as long as there are those who choose where to stand, the war is already decided. After the war ended without ending, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No celebration. No reckoning. No moment when the world paused and said, "Now we are safe." Life continued the way it always does, unevenly, imperfectly, stubbornly. People worked, loved, fought each other for reasons that had nothing to do with stars or invaders. Children were born who had never heard the name Hoy, never imagined Martians watching from beyond the dark. And yet, the pattern remained. When pressure came, humanity bent instead of snapping. When systems demanded obedience, someone somewhere made them inefficient. When power assumed compliance, it encountered friction where none should exist, not because people remembered why, but because they remembered how. That is the most dangerous inheritance of all. The Martians, wherever they went afterward, carried Earth with them, not as a threat but as a limit. In their records, in their projections, in the quiet margins of their calculations, there was always a note they could not remove. Avoid narrow places. Avoid cultures that teach refusal without instruction. Avoid species that do not require victory to continue. They did not speak of Vikings. They did not speak of 47 men. They spoke of anomalous persistence. Back on Earth, the stories thinned with time. They lost names, lost locations, lost enemies. In some tellings, the invaders became gods, in others, storms, in others still nothing more than metaphors for hardship. But in every version, one thing survived. A moment when someone said, "Here we stand. Here we slow you. Here you pay." That is how myths outlive history. That is how history outlives empires. If you listen carefully to the way people resist being rushed, to the way communities instinctively protect their edges, to the way humanity never quite becomes what it is told it must be, you can still hear it. The echo of boots on frozen ground, the weight of shields locking together, the silence before refusal. The Vikings are not gone. They are simply no longer named. And perhaps that is how they finally won. There is a belief, common among those who study wars from a distance, that conflict ends when the enemy leaves. This is not true. Conflict ends only when its lessons are no longer needed. And that has never happened. Long after the Martians turned their attention elsewhere, long after their machines faded into debris, and their calculations hardened into warnings no one would ever read aloud, Earth continued to produce moments that looked strangely familiar. A city that refused to function as intended, a network that fractured instead of submitting, a population that did not revolt but also did not comply. Observers called it chaos. Administrators called it inefficiency. Strategists called it unpredictable. The old stories would have called it good ground, because what the Vikings left behind was not a weapon or a doctrine or even a story with a clear beginning and end. What they left was a habit of choosing where to stand and understanding that the choice itself was the act of resistance. No one taught this directly. It emerged when people were pressed too hard, when certainty became suffocating, when power forgot that momentum depends on cooperation. That is when the old shape returned. Stand close, reduce space, deny speed, make every step forward cost more than the last. The Vikings had learned it from ice and stone. Humanity learned it from necessity. And somewhere far beyond any sky humanity could reach, the Martians finalized their last assessment of Earth. It was brief, unsatisfying, impossible to optimize. The planet was not hostile, not militarized, not unified. It was worse. It was unfinishable, so they left it alone. That is the ending history prefers: quiet, unresolved, inconvenient. No final battle, no decisive victory, just a slow recognition that some worlds are not worth the effort required to dominate them. And so the saga closes the only way it can, not with an answer, but with a condition. As long as people choose narrow places over open submission, as long as they understand that standing together can slow anything, as long as they remember, without quite remembering why, the war does not need to be fought again, because it is already being refused. This is what the Vikings gave the world, not glory, not conquest, but the knowledge that even the greatest forces, even those that come from the stars, can be told simply and finally no. After the last word, after no, there is always a pause. It is the pause power does not understand. The Martians expected celebration or collapse or at least relief. They expected humanity to exhale and move on, to forget the pressure that had shaped it. Instead, they observed something quieter and far more unsettling. Humanity did not relax. It remembered how to be tense. Generations passed. The sky filled with human-made stars. Machines learned to speak. Distance shrank. Speed became ordinary. From the outside, Earth began to look predictable again, busy, loud, confident in its own progress. But under that surface, the Viking inheritance persisted. People distrusted perfect systems. Communities built redundancies where none were required. Central authority was tolerated but never loved. Whenever a structure grew too smooth, too certain, someone instinctively disrupted it. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to introduce friction, just enough to keep the future from locking into a single shape. Historians would later struggle with this era. They would write of inefficiencies that made no sense, of cultural habits that resisted optimization, of social instincts that valued resilience over elegance. They would argue endlessly about why humanity refused to become simpler. They would never agree, because the answer did not exist as an idea. It existed as a reflex. In one unrecorded moment, centuries after Hoy's bones had become dust, a Martian observer lingered longer than permitted near Earth's orbit. It watched human signals scatter and recombine, watched conflicts flare and dissipate without resolution, watched systems fail without collapsing. The observer reached a conclusion it could not share. Earth was not defended by weapons. It was defended by uncoordinated refusal. No leader could surrender the species. No treaty could bind it fully. No victory could ever be final. The observer withdrew. And somewhere on Earth, a child heard a story told badly, out of order, missing details, full of mistakes about Vikings and stars and standing fast in the cold. The child did not understand it, but years later, under pressure, they would choose to slow something instead of fleeing it. That is how the saga continues, not as myth, not as history, but as behavior that refuses to die. After the refusal, after the quiet, after the watchers withdrew and the sky learned to keep its distance, the world did what it always does. It tried to forget, not out of malice, not out of denial, but because forgetting is how life continues when memory becomes too heavy to carry whole. Names softened, details blurred. The Martians became symbols, then metaphors, then nothing at all. The Vikings became a people of the past again, raiders, sailors, ghosts of a colder age. But forgetting never works the way power hopes it will, because some things do not live in memory, they live in shape. The shape returned whenever pressure narrowed choices, whenever speed demanded obedience, whenever certainty arrived with the promise that resistance was inefficient, outdated, unnecessary. It returned in factories that refused single points of failure, in cities that grew uneven instead of symmetrical, in networks that fragmented on purpose, It returned in labor disputes that did not escalate into revolution but also did not dissolve, in communities that would not centralize even when it made sense to do so, in cultures that mistrusted perfect solutions the way sailors mistrust calm seas that last too long. The shape did not announce itself. It never said this is resistance. It simply said slow down, and slowing down just enough changed outcomes. Somewhere centuries after the mountain pass, a coastal settlement faced absorption by a vast administrative system that promised efficiency and safety. The offer was generous. The terms were clean. The logic was flawless. The settlement delayed, meetings stretched, decisions fractured, authority rotated. Requirements multiplied until compliance cost more effort than autonomy. No one planned it. No one led it. The system moved on. Elsewhere, a technological network designed to unify communication across continents encountered persistent, localized failures. Not sabotage, not rebellion, just habits, people choosing alternatives, redundancies, parallel paths that refused convergence. Engineers patched, analysts optimized. Models improved, the failures persisted. Again and again the pattern emerged. Humanity did not break systems head-on. It bent around them, it made them heavy, slow, costly to maintain, unprofitable to dominate. This was not strategy. This was inheritance. The Martians had understood too late that they were not fighting warriors or nations or even stories. They were fighting something far more difficult to erase, a way of responding to pressure that had been burned into a species by cold ground and narrow places. The Vikings had never needed to survive as a people forever. They had only needed to survive long enough to teach the world one lesson well. Choose where you stand. Make momentum pay for itself. Let refusal be quiet and shared. And so the shape endured. In times of crisis, humanity did not become singular. It became plural. In times of threat, it did not unify cleanly. It clustered messily. In times of domination, it did not rebel loudly. It resisted sideways. The stars remained silent. Perhaps they always would. Or perhaps they were simply waiting for a world that could be finished cleanly, efficiently, without learning anything dangerous in the process. Earth was not that world. It never had been. Because long ago, in a place the maps forgot, Vikings stood in a narrow pass and taught the future how to refuse without asking permission. And the future listened. Not all at once, not consciously, but forever. Let me tell you this part carefully, because this is where many listeners become confused. The Vikings did not fight only the Martians. That is the mistake people make when they hear the saga for the first time. They imagine a single impossible war, a single enemy from the sky, a single moment when history bent and then returned to its course. That is not how it happened. The Vikings were already fighting everyone. Long before the sky burned red, long before iron fell from the heavens, the Vikings were locked in constant struggle, with kings who wanted tribute, with empires that wanted obedience, with faiths that demanded submission, with neighbors who wanted their land and rivers and sons. The North was never quiet. It was only honest about violence. So when the Martians came, the Vikings did not treat them as something sacred or incomprehensible. They treated them as another enemy who believed too much in their own certainty. This is why the Vikings survived what others could not. They had already fought men who came with banners and promises. They had already fought priests who claimed divine authority. They had already fought armies that believed numbers alone decided fate. The Martians were simply the first enemy arrogant enough to arrive from the stars. After the mountain pass and the burning valley, the Vikings did not return to peace. They returned to war as they always had, fragmented, local, personal. In the south, expanding kingdoms pressed harder, believing the northern resistance weakened. In the east, traders backed by soldiers demanded control of routes and ports. In the west, rival clans smelled blood and opportunity. The Vikings fought them all, not with grand campaigns, not with declarations, but with refusal. They chose bad ground for invaders and good ground for defense. They broke supply lines without claiming responsibility. They let enemies advance until the cost of holding territory exceeded its value. They disappeared when confronted directly and reappeared where control was weakest. This confused historians later. They would write that Viking resistance was inconsistent, uncoordinated, unsustainable. They were wrong. It was adaptive. When Martian scouts returned in later years, silent, cautious, altered, they did not see a unified Viking front. They saw raiders on the sea, farmers inland, mercenaries in foreign wars, traders carrying strange stories into distant cities. What they did not see was a weakness. They saw a people who could fight multiple enemies without prioritizing any of them. That terrified the Martians more than Axes ever had, because it meant the Vikings did not organize their world around a single threat. They did not become obsessed. They did not restructure their lives around fear of the sky. The Martians were simply added to a long list of forces that had to be slowed, bled, and made unprofitable. In one recorded incident, lost later, pieced together only through fragments, a Martian unit attempted to manipulate a southern kingdom into subduing the northern coast on its behalf. The plan was elegant, the logic flawless. The kingdom marched north and vanished, not destroyed in a single battle, not massacred, simply dissolved, units deserted, supplies failed. Local guides misled them into marsh and forest. Winter arrived early. Resistance appeared where it should not have existed. The Martians withdrew their support. The lesson repeated. Whether the enemy came with crosses, crowns, or starfire, the result was the same. The Vikings did not seek decisive victory. They sought endurance with teeth. And this is the part that matters most. The Vikings did not believe the Martians were the final enemy. They believed there would always be another one. That belief shaped everything. It is why they never centralized, why they never wrote a final version of the saga, why they never claimed to have saved the world. They understood something empires and invaders never do. The enemy changes, the method must not. So the Vikings fought kings, they fought priests, they fought armies, they fought Martians, and they fought them all the same way, by choosing where to stand, by refusing to be finished, by making domination cost more than it was worth. That is why the Vikings remain in this story. Not as heroes frozen in time, but as a people who understood that survival is not about defeating every enemy. It is about outlasting the idea that any enemy is inevitable. Now we reach the part of the saga where the telling must slow, because this is where history, myth, and survival knot together so tightly that separating them would break the truth itself. The Vikings did not live in a world with a single war. They lived in a world where conflict was the weather. Storms came from the south in the form of kings who wanted tribute and obedience. Storms came from the west in the form of rival clans who wanted land and honor. Storms came from the east as merchants backed by soldiers who spoke of order and profit. And storms came from above, when the Martians fell from the sky and tried to turn the world into a problem to be solved. The mistake later ages made was assuming these wars happened one after another. They did not. They overlapped. While Martian scouts still lingered beyond the clouds, Viking longships cut through gray seas toward foreign coasts. While iron machines watched forests from the shadows, Viking farmers defended their land from advancing lords. While unseen intelligences calculated humanity's future, Viking mercenaries fought in wars that had nothing to do with the stars, carrying old habits into new lands. This is why the Vikings mattered. They never allowed one enemy to become the enemy. To the Vikings, the Martians were terrifying, but not unique. They were simply the most distant expression of something the North had always known. Power arrives claiming inevitability, and inevitability must be challenged. After the mountain pass, after the valley burned and the sky withdrew, Viking leaders, if they can be called that, made no proclamation. No council declared a new age. No banner was raised announcing resistance against the stars. Instead, life continued. That continuation was the weapon. A Viking named Esbjorn took service with a southern king whose armies marched in tight formations and believed discipline alone won wars. Esbjorn taught his unit to fight in broken ground, to refuse pursuit, to vanish when pressed. When the king demanded a decisive victory, the war stalled instead, slowly bleeding resources and patience until the campaign collapsed under its own weight. A shield maiden named Freydis settled inland, marrying into a farming community that sat astride a critical trade route. When an empire attempted to formalize control, the route became unusable. Bridges failed, records disappeared, local leaders rotated too quickly to coerce. The empire moved its attention elsewhere. None of this was coordinated. That was the point. The Martians observed this with growing unease. Their early models had assumed humanity would respond to existential threat by unifying, by building hierarchies, central commands, and rigid strategies. That is how the Martians themselves had evolved. That is how conquest usually simplified resistance. The Vikings broke that assumption. They did not unify humanity. They infected it with disunity that worked. The Martians attempted to isolate this behavior. They traced it back through cultural patterns, through stories, through fragments of sagas that refused to settle into canonical form. Again and again, they found the same root: Viking habits embedded in places far from the north. The Martians tried to remove the root. They influenced rulers to suppress old traditions. They encouraged religions that emphasized submission and order. They promoted systems that rewarded efficiency above resilience. Where possible, they erased stories of refusal and reframed them as cautionary tales about chaos. For a time, it succeeded. The Vikings faded from prominence. Their ships rotted. Their names softened into legend. Their gods were replaced or forgotten. To human eyes, it looked like the end of an era. To Martian eyes, it looked like victory. Then came the fractures. Empires grew too large and collapsed suddenly, not from rebellion but from inefficiency. Systems optimized beyond flexibility failed catastrophically under stress. Populations refused to respond predictably to pressure, fragmenting instead of aligning. The Martians adjusted their models. The Viking pattern had not died. It had gone underground. This is where the saga becomes uncomfortable for those who prefer clean endings, because it reveals something unsettling. The Vikings did not save the world from the Martians. They taught the world how to survive bad rulers, bad gods, bad systems, and bad futures all at once. The Martians were simply the first enemy who noticed. In later centuries, long after the last Viking longship had vanished from the sea, humanity faced other threats. Some came from within, some from beyond. Some wore the mask of progress, others wore the mask of necessity. Each time the response followed the same shape. People did not rush to overthrow. They did not rally around single leaders. They did not seek final battles. They slowed things down. They complicated processes. They created parallel systems. They chose difficult ground, socially, culturally, geographically. The Martians, watching from afar, began to understand the true scope of what the Vikings had done. They had not created resistance to Martians. They had created resistance to domination itself. In one final attempt to resolve the problem, the Martians ran a projection that extended thousands of years into the future. It simulated invasions, influences, withdrawals, escalations. Every path that led to domination required a level of destruction that rendered the planet useless. The conclusion was clear. Earth could be conquered, but only by becoming something worse than what the Martians already were. So they stopped, not because they were defeated in battle, not because they feared Viking axes, but because the Vikings had ensured that ruling humanity would never be clean, efficient, or final. And that was unacceptable. This is why the Vikings remain in the story, even when centuries pass without their name being spoken. This is why they fought Martians, kings, empires, priests, and each other, and treated all those wars as variations of the same struggle. They understood something simple and brutal: the enemy will always change. The pressure will always return. What matters is not who you fight, but how you refuse. And that refusal, once learned, does not belong to a single people anymore. It belongs to the world. Every long war circles back to its beginning. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the conditions that make resistance possible never truly change. Pressure still seeks speed. Power still seeks certainty. And somewhere, always, there is a narrow place where those things falter. Long after the Vikings had ceased to be a people anyone could point to on a map, long after their names had softened into echoes and their gods into half-remembered metaphors, the world found itself narrowing again. Not with fire from the sky this time. With necessity. The oceans rose and fell unpredictably. Trade routes stretched thin and snapped. Systems built for endless growth discovered edges they had pretended did not exist. Information moved too fast to be trusted, too slowly to be controlled. Humanity did not face a single enemy, but a convergence of pressures that demanded obedience in exchange for survival. Efficiency became the new inevitability. And inevitability, as the Vikings had taught long ago, is always the opening move of domination. The Martians were watching again. They had never truly stopped. Their presence was quieter now, more abstract, patterns in data, nudges in probability, small interventions meant to test whether Earth had finally become manageable. They did not descend in iron. They did not announce themselves. They waited to see if humanity would organize itself into something smooth enough to rule. For a time, it seemed possible. Global systems aligned, decision-making centralized, Predictive models improved. The world began to resemble something the Martians understood, a problem with a single solution. That was when the narrow places returned. Not mountains or passes this time, but choke points of trust, of culture, of meaning. Places where decisions could not be automated without breaking something essential. Communities that refused to scale cleanly. Networks that insisted on redundancy. People who chose inconvenience over surrender without quite knowing why. The shape resurfaced. A coastal region declined integration into a unified system, citing local conditions too complex to standardize. A coalition of cities rejected a single governing algorithm, opting instead for layered, conflicting processes that slowed everything down. A population adopted technologies selectively, refusing updates that optimized control more than benefit. None of it was coordinated. All of it was familiar. The Martians noticed immediately. Their projections diverged. The future fractured again into multiple branches instead of collapsing into one. Control required effort. Effort required escalation. Escalation risked exposure. And exposure had never ended well on this world. Somewhere deep within Martian decision architecture, an ancient record resurfaced. Not text, not imagery. A behavioral imprint tagged millennia earlier during the first observation cycle. Designation, Viking pattern characteristics. Decentralized refusal preference for difficult ground cultural memory embedded as instinct resistance without command structure assessment updated. Probability of clean domination, negligible. The Martians hesitated. And that hesitation changed everything. Because humanity, sensing, not consciously but collectively, that pressure had slowed, did not rush forward. It did not seize the moment for triumph. It did what it had learned to do best. It complicated the moment. Old stories re-emerged, stripped of names but heavy with instruction. Tales of standing together without leaders. Of choosing where to stop rather than where to advance, of valuing endurance over victory. They were told as fiction, as metaphor, as entertainment. They did their work anyway. In one such story, told badly and out of order, a group of Vikings stood against an enemy they did not understand and refused to move. The enemy was sometimes described as gods, sometimes as machines, sometimes as fate itself. The details changed. The shape did not. Listeners did not ask if it was true. They asked what it meant. That was enough. The Martians withdrew their active probes again, not because they were forced, but because the cost curve had bent the wrong way. Earth was still conquerable in theory, but theory had never survived contact with Viking ground conditions. Every attempt to smooth the planet created resistance. Every effort to simplify increased friction. Every move toward certainty produced a new narrow place. And narrow places favor those who stand still. Somewhere, a human analyst, brilliant, exhausted, curious, noticed something strange while studying historical responses to systemic pressure. Across centuries, across cultures, across technologies, the same behaviors emerged, the same delays, the same decentralizations, the same refusal to finish what domination began. The analyst wrote a paper, was ignored, but the idea spread anyway, leaking into conversations, shaping decisions, altering instincts. The analyst never mentioned Vikings, never mentioned Martians. The language was neutral, academic, safe. The shape survived. That is how the saga completes itself, not with a final battle, not with a revelation, not with a declaration that the war is over, but with a recognition. The Vikings were never meant to be remembered as heroes. They were meant to be remembered as a way of responding. They fought kings. They fought empires. They fought Martians. They treated all of them the same, by denying them the future they expected. And so the world continues uneven, inefficient, stubbornly alive. The stars remain distant. The sky remains watched. The pressure will return because it always does, but somewhere, always, there will be a narrow place, and someone will choose it. That is the end of the saga, which is to say, it is. If you have stayed this long, then you already understand something important. You understand that this was never only a story about Vikings, and never only a story about Martians, and never only a story about war. It was a story about pressure. Pressure is the true enemy of every age. It arrives wearing different faces, sometimes a king, sometimes an empire, sometimes a god, sometimes a machine, sometimes a future that insists it cannot be resisted. Pressure always speaks the same language. It says, "This is inevitable. This is efficient. This is the only way forward." The Vikings heard that voice long before the sky ever burned red. They heard it when foreign kings demanded tribute. They heard it when missionaries demanded obedience. They heard it when empires demanded roads, taxes, order, and silence. And when the Martians came, cold, distant, certain, the Vikings recognized the voice immediately. That is why they did not panic. That is why they did not worship. That is why they did not surrender. They had fought inevitability before. The first narrow place was a mountain pass, yes, but that was only the beginning. Every war that followed was another narrowing. Another moment where the world asked a question that could not be answered with speed or submission. And each time the answer was the same. Here we stand. Here we slow you. Here you pay. The Martians never understood that the Vikings were not defending land. They were defending choice. The choice to stand instead of move. The choice to resist without permission. The choice to refuse without needing victory. That is why the Martians failed. Not because they lacked power, but because power assumes an ending. It assumes that if you push hard enough, the world will eventually give way. The Vikings knew better. They knew that if you choose the right ground, you do not need to push back. You only need to remain. And remain they did, not as a nation, not as an army, not even as a people in the way history likes to define such things. They remained as a shape, a pattern. A reflex passed down through blood, culture, story, and silence. That is why this saga never resolved into a single moment of triumph. There was no final battle in space, no decisive defeat of the Martians, no declaration that the war was over, because wars like this do not end that way. They end when the enemy decides the cost is no longer worth the outcome. And that is exactly what happened. The Martians left not because Earth was strong, but because Earth was difficult. Not unified, not obedient, not predictable. A world full of narrow places and people who instinctively chose them. And now, listen carefully, because this is the part that matters most. The Vikings are not gone. They are not buried in the past. They are not trapped in sagas and longships and old gods. They exist every time someone refuses to be rushed, every time a system is slowed on purpose, every time people stand together without waiting for permission, every time inevitability is questioned instead of accepted. That is the inheritance. That is the victory. If the Martians are still watching, and perhaps they are, then they are watching a world that never learned how to finish being conquered. A world that does not need heroes every time. A world that does not need final answers. A world that learned long ago from Vikings standing in the cold that survival does not require dominance, only refusal. And so the saga ends the only way it ever could. Not with silence, but with continuation. Because as long as people remember, even imperfectly, even incorrectly, even only in shape, the story will keep doing its work. And now, if you've made it all the way here, let me ask you something. If you enjoyed this saga, if you felt the weight of it, the cold of it, the stubbornness of it, subscribe so you don't miss the next story like this. These tales only work when they're carried forward. Leave a comment and tell me what part of the story stayed with you the most. Was it the Vikings, the Martians, the narrow places, the idea of refusal itself? And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? What land, what city, what corner of the world is hearing this saga right now? Finally, if you watched all the way to the end, let me know in the comments. Say anything, a word, a symbol, a simple here. Because stories like this don't end when they're told. They end when they're remembered. And now they belong to you.